Hi guys. Thank you so much for being here with me tonight. Today's video is going to be a continuation of A Walk to Remember. I apologize for already not following through on my schedule. Last week I was feeling really under the weather and I tried filming a video, but I just kept coughing and clearing my throat the whole time. So I scratched that. I took the week to rest and I am feeling so much better. So I will be filming a video for Saturday and Sunday. And yeah, I think that's all I have for you guys. So I have a pretty substantial glass of wine right here. And I also have my water for my water breaks and wine breaks. And let's get this candle lit and start reading. As I said before, Beaufort was fairly typical as far as southern towns went, though it did have an interesting history. Blackbeard the pirate once owned a house there, and his ship, Queen Anne's Revenge, is supposedly buried somewhere in the sand just offshore. Recently, some archaeologists or oceanographers, or whoever looks for stuff like that, said that they found it, but no one's certain just yet, being that it sank over 250 years ago, and you can't exactly reach into the glove compartment and check the registration. Beaufort's come a long way since the 1950s, but it's still not exactly a major metropolis or anything. Beaufort was, and always will be, on the smallish side, but when I was growing up, it barely warranted a place on the map. To put it into perspective, the congressional district that included Beaufort covered the entire eastern part of the state, some 20,000 square miles, and there wasn't a single person with more than 25,000 people. Even compared with those towns, Beaufort was regarded as being on the small side. Everything east of Raleigh and north of Wilmington, all the way to the Virginia border, was the district my father represented. I suppose you've heard of him. He's sort of a legend, even now. His name is Worth Carter, and he was a congressman for almost 30 years. His slogan every other year during the election season was Worth Carter represents blank. And the person was supposed to fill in the city name where he or she lived. I can remember it, driving on trips when me and Mom had to make our appearance to show the people he was a true family man, that we'd seen the bumper stickers stenciled in names like Otway and Chocowitney and Seven Springs. Nowadays, stuff like that wouldn't fly, but back then it was fairly sophisticated publicity. I imagine if he tried to do that now, people opposing him would insert all sorts of foul language in the blank space, but we never saw it once. Okay, maybe once. A farmer from Dublin County once wrote the word shit in the blank space, and when my mom saw it, she covered my eyes and said a prayer asking for forgiveness for the poor, ignorant bastard. She didn't say exactly those words, but I got the gist of it. So my father, Mr. Congressman, was a bigwig, and everyone but everyone knew it, including Old Man Hagbert, Now, the two of them didn't get along, not at all, despite the fact that my father went to Hagbert's church whenever he was in town, which, to be frank, wasn't all that often. Hegbert, in addition to his belief that fornicators were destined to clean the urinals in hell, also believed that communism was, quote, a sickness that doomed mankind to heathenhood. Even though heathenhood wasn't a word, I can't find it in any dictionary, the congregation knew what he meant. They also knew that he was directing his words specifically to my father, who would sit with his eyes closed and pretend not to listen. My father was on one of the House committees that oversaw the, quote, red influence, supposedly infiltrating every aspect of the country, including national defense, higher education, and even tobacco farming. You have to remember that this was during the Cold War. Tensions were running high, and we, North Carolinians, needed something to bring it down to a more personal level. My father had consistently looked for facts, which were irrelevant to people like Hegbert. Irrelevant, not irrelevant. Afterward, when my father would come home after the service, he'd say something like, "Reverend Sullivan was in rare form today. I hope you heard that part about the scripture where Jesus was talking about the poor." "Yeah, sure, Dad." My father tried to diffuse situations whenever possible. I think that's why he stayed in Congress for so long. The guy could kiss the ugliest babies known to mankind and still come up with something nice to say. "He's such a gentle child," he'd say when a baby had a giant head. Or, "I bet she's the sweetest girl in the world if she had a birthmark over her entire face." One time, a lady showed up with a kid in a wheelchair. My father took one look at him and said, "I'll bet you 10 to 1 that you're the smartest kid in your class." And he was. Yeah, my father was great at stuff like that. He could fling it with the best of them, that's for sure. And he wasn't such a bad guy, not really, especially if you consider the fact that he didn't beat me or anything. But he wasn't there for me growing up. I hate to say that because nowadays people claim that sort of stuff, even if their parent was around, and use it to excuse their behavior. My dad, he didn't love me. That's why I became a stripper and performed on the Jerry Springer Show. I'm not using it to excuse the person I've become. I'm simply saying it as a fact. My father was gone 9 months of the year, living out of town in a Washington, D.C. apartment 300 miles away. My mother didn't go with him because both of them wanted me to grow up, quote, the same way they had, end quote. Of course, my father's father took him hunting and fishing, taught him to play ball, showed up for birthday parties, all this small stuff that adds up to quite a bit before adulthood. My father, on the other hand, was a stranger, someone I barely knew at all. For the first 5 years of my life, I thought all fathers lived somewhere else. It wasn't until my best friend, Eric Hunter, asked me in kindergarten who that guy was that showed up at my house the night before that I realized something wasn't quite right about the situation. "He's my father," I said proudly. "Oh," Eric said as he rifled through my lunchbox looking for my Milky Way. "I didn't know you had a father." Talk about something whacking you straight in the face. So, I grew up under the care of my mother. Now she was a nice lady, sweet and gentle, the kind of mother most people dream about. But she wasn't, nor could she ever be, a manly influence in my life. And that fact, coupled with my growing disillusionment with my father, made me become something of a rebel, even at a young age. Not a bad one, mind you. Me and my friends might sneak out late and soap up car windows now and then, or eat boiled peanuts in the graveyard behind the church. But in the 50s, that was the kind of thing that made other parents shake their heads and whisper to their children, You don't want to be like that Carter boy. He's on the fast track to prison. Me, a bad boy, for eating boiled peanuts in the graveyard. Go figure. Anyway, my father and Hegbert didn't get along, but it wasn't only because of politics. No, it seemed that my father and Hegbert knew each other from way back when. Hegbert was about 20 years older than my father, and back before he was a minister, he used to work for my father's father, my grandfather. Even though he spent lots of time with my father, was a true bastard if there ever was one. He was the one, by the way, who made the family fortune, but I don't want you to imagine him as the sort of man who slaved over his business, working diligently and watching it grow, prospering slowly over time. My grandfather was much shrewder than that. The way he made his money was simple. He started as a bootlegger, accumulating wealth throughout Prohibition by running rum up from Cuba. Then he began buying land and hiring sharecroppers to work it. He took 90% of the money the sharecroppers made on their tobacco crop, then loaned them money whenever they needed it at ridiculous interest rates. Of course, he never intended to collect the money. Instead, he would foreclose on any land or equipment that they happened to own. Then, in what he called his, quote, moment of inspiration, he started a bank called Carter Banking and Loan. The only other bank in a 2-county radius had mysteriously burned down, and with the onset of the Depression, it never reopened. Though everyone knew what had really happened, not a word was ever spoken for fear of retribution, and their fear was well placed. The bank wasn't the only building that had mysteriously burned down. Wine and water break. His interest rates were outrageous, and little by little, he began amassing more land and property as people defaulted on their loans. When the Depression hit hardest, he foreclosed on dozens of businesses throughout the county, while retaining the original owners to continue to work on salary, paying them just enough to keep them where they were, because they had nowhere else to go. He told them that when the economy improved, he'd sell their business back to them, and people always believed him. Never once, however, did he keep his promise. In the end, he controlled a vast portion of the county's economy, and he abused his clout in every way imaginable. I'd like to tell you he eventually went to a terrible death, but he didn't. He died at a ripe old age while sleeping with his mistress on his yacht off the Cayman Islands. He'd outlived both his wives and his only son. Some end for a guy like that, huh? Life, I've learned, is never fair. If people teach anything in school, that should be it. But back to the story. Hegbert, once he realized what a bastard my grandfather really was, quit working for him and went into the ministry, then came back to Beaufort and started ministering in the same church we attended. He spent his first few years perfecting his fire and brimstone act with monthly sermons on the evils of the greedy, and this left him scant time for anything else. He was 43 before he ever got married. He was 55 when his daughter, Jamie Sullivan, was born. His wife, a wispy little thing 20 years younger than he, went through 6 miscarriages before Jamie was born. And in the end, she died in childbirth, making Hegbert a widower who had to raise a daughter on his own. Hence, of course, the story behind the play. People knew the story even before the play was first performed. It was one of those stories that made its rounds whenever Hegbert had to baptize a baby or attend a funeral. Everyone knew about it, and that's why, I think, so many people got emotional whenever they saw the Christmas play. They knew it was based on something that happened in real life, which gave it special meaning. Jamie Sullivan was a senior in high school, just like me, and she'd already been chosen to play the angel, not that anyone else had a chance. This, of course, made the play extra special that year. It was going to be a big deal, maybe the biggest ever, at least in Miss Garber's mind. She was a drama teacher, and she was already glowing about the possibilities the first time I met her in class. Now, I hadn't really planned on taking drama that year. I really hadn't. But it was either that or chemistry too. The thing was, I thought it would be a blow-off class, especially when compared with my other option. No papers, no tests, no tables where I'd have to memorize protons and neutrons and combine elements and their proper formulas. What could possibly be better for a high school senior? It seemed like a sure thing, and when I signed up for it, I thought I'd just be able to sleep through most every class, which, considering my late-night peanut eating, was fairly important at the time. On the first day of class, I was one of the last to arrive, coming in just a few seconds before the bell rang, and I took a seat in the back of the room. Miss Garber had her back turned to the class, and she was busy writing her name in big cursive letters, as if we didn't know who she was. Everyone knew her. It was impossible not to. She was big, at least 6 feet tall, with flaming red hair and pale skin that showed her freckles well into her 40s. She was also overweight. I'd say honestly she pushed 250, and she had a fondness for wearing flower-patterned muumuus. She had thick, dark, horned-rimmed glasses, and she greeted everyone with, "Hello," sort of singing the last syllable. Miss Garber was one of a kind, that's for sure, and she was single, which made it even worse. A guy, no matter how old, couldn't help but feel sorry for a gal like her. Water break. Beneath her name, she wrote the goals she wanted to accomplish that year. Self-confidence was number 1, followed by self-awareness, and third, self-fulfillment. Miss Garber was big into the self stuff, which puts her really ahead of the curve as far as psychotherapy is concerned, though she probably didn't realize it at the time. Miss Garber was a pioneer in that field. Maybe it had something to do with the way she looked. Maybe she was just trying to feel better about herself, but I digress. It wasn't until the class started that I noticed something unusual. Though Beaufort High School wasn't large, I knew for a fact that it was pretty much split 50-50 between males and females, which was why I was surprised when I saw that this class was at least 90% female. There was only one other male in the class, which to my thinking was a good thing, and for a moment I felt flushed with a look on world, here I come kind of feeling. Girls, 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 I couldn't help but think. Girls and girls with no tests in sight. Okay, so I wasn't the most forward-thinking guy on the block. So Miss Garber brings up the Christmas play and tells everyone that Jamie Sullivan is going to be the angel that year. Miss Garber starts clapping right away. She was a member of the church, too. And there were a lot of people who thought she was gunning for Hegbert in a sort of romantic way. The first time I heard it, I remember thinking that it was a good thing that they were too old to have children, if they ever did get together. Imagine, translucent with freckles. The very thought gave everyone shudders, but of course, no one ever said anything about it, at least within hearing distance of Miss Garber and Hagbert. Gossip is one thing, hurtful gossip is completely another, and even in high school, we weren't that mean. Miss Garber kept on clapping all alone for a while, until all of us finally joined in, because it was obvious that was what she wanted. "Stand up, Jamie," she said. So Jamie stood up and turned around, and Miss Garber started clapping even faster, as if she were standing in the presence of a bona fide movie star. Now, Jamie Sullivan was a nice girl. She really was. Beaufort was small enough that it had only one elementary school, so we'd been in the same classes our entire lives, and I'd be lying if I said I never talked to her. Once in second grade, she'd sat in the seat right next to me for the whole year, and we'd even had a few conversations, but it didn't mean that I spent a lot of time hanging out with her in my spare time, even back then. Who I saw in school was one thing. Who I saw after school was something completely different, and Jamie had never been on my social calendar. It's not that Jamie was unattractive, don't get me wrong. She wasn't hideous or anything like that. Fortunately, she'd taken after her mother, who, based on the pictures I'd seen, wasn't half bad, especially considering who she'd ended up marrying. But Jamie wasn't exactly what I considered attractive either. Despite the fact that she was thin, with honey blonde hair and soft blue eyes, most of the time she looked sort of plain, and that was when you noticed her at all. Jamie didn't care much about outward appearances because she was always looking for things like inner beauty, and I suppose that's part of the reason she looked the way she did. For as long as I'd known her, and this was going way back, remember, she'd always worn her hair in a tight bun, almost like a spinster, without a stitch of makeup on her face. Coupled with her usual brown cardigan and plaid skirt, she always looked as though she were on her way to interview for a job at the library. We used to think that it was just a phase and that she'd eventually grow out of it, but she never had. Even through our first 3 years of high school, she hadn't changed at all. The only thing that changed was the size of her clothes. But it wasn't just the way Jamie looked that made her different. It was also the way she acted. Jamie didn't spend any time hanging out at Cecile's diner or going to slumber parties with other girls. And I knew for a fact that she never had a boyfriend her entire life. Old Hagbert would probably have had a heart attack if she did. But even if by some odd turn of events Hagbert had allowed it, it still wouldn't have mattered. Jamie carried her Bible wherever she went, and if her looks and Hagbert didn't keep the boys away, the Bible sure as heck did. Now, I liked the Bible as much as the next teenage boy, but Jamie seemed to enjoy it in a way that was completely foreign to me. Not only did she go to vacation Bible school every August, but she would read the Bible during lunch break at school. In my mind, that just wasn't normal, even if she was the minister's daughter. No matter how you sliced it, reading Paul's letters to the Ephesians wasn't as much fun as flirting, if you know what I mean. But Jamie didn't stop there. Because of all her Bible reading, or maybe because of Hagbert's influence, Jamie believed it was important to help others, and helping others is exactly what she did. I knew she volunteered at the orphanage in Moorhead City, but for her, that simply wasn't enough. She was always in charge of one fundraiser or another, helping everyone from the Boy Scouts to the Indian princesses, and I know that when she was 14, she spent part of her summer painting the outside of an elderly neighbor's house. Jamie was the kind of girl who would pull weeds in someone's garden without being asked, or stop traffic to help little kids cross the road. She'd save her allowance to buy a new basketball for the orphans, or she'd turn around and drop the money into the church basket on Sunday. She was, in other words, the kind of girl who made the rest of us look bad. And whenever she glanced my way, I couldn't help but feel guilty, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. Nor did Jamie limit her good deeds on people. If she'd ever come across a wounded animal, for instance, she'd try to help it too. Opossums, squirrels, dogs, cats, frogs, it didn't matter to her. Dr. Rawlings, the vet, knew her by sight, and he'd shake his head whenever he saw her walking up to the door, carrying a cardboard box with yet another critter inside. He'd take off his eyeglasses and wipe them with his handkerchief, while Jamie explained how she'd found the poor creature and what had happened to it. He was hit by a car, Dr. Rawlings. I think it was the Lord's plan to have me find him and try to save him. You'll help me, won't you? With Jamie, everything was the Lord's plan. That was another thing. She'd always mention the Lord's plan whenever you talked to her, no matter what the subject. The baseball games rained out? Must be the Lord's plan to prevent something worse from happening. A surprise trigonometry quiz that everyone in class fails? Must be the Lord's plan to give us challenges. Anyway, you get the picture. Then, of course, there was the whole Hagbert situation, and this didn't help her at all. Being the minister's daughter couldn't have been easy, but she made it seem as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and that she was lucky to have been blessed in that way. That's how she used to say it too. I've been so blessed to have a father like mine. Whenever she said it, all we could do was shake our heads and wonder what planet she actually came from. Despite all these other strikes, though, the one thing that really drove me crazy about her was the fact that she was always so damn cheerful, no matter what was happening around her. I swear, that girl never said a bad thing about anyone or anything, even to those of us who weren't that nice to her. She would hum to herself as she walked down the street. She would wave to strangers driving in their cars. Sometimes ladies would come running out of their house if they saw her walking by, offering her pumpkin bread if they'd been baking all day, or lemonade if the sun was high in the sky. It seemed as if every adult in town adored her. She's such a nice young lady, they'd say, whenever Jamie's name came up. The world would be a better place if there were more people like her. But my friends and I didn't quite see it that way. In our minds, one Jamie Sullivan was plenty. I was thinking about all this while Jamie stood in front of us on the first day of drama class, and I admit that I wasn't much interested in seeing her. But strangely, when Jamie turned to face us, I kind of got a shock, like I was sitting on a loose wire or something. She wore a plaid skirt with a white blouse under the same brown cardigan sweater I'd seen a million times. But there were 2 new bumps on her chest that the sweater couldn't hide, that I swore hadn't been there just 3 months earlier. She'd never worn makeup, and she still didn't, but she had a tan, probably from Bible school, and for the first time she looked, well, almost pretty. Of course, I dismissed that thought right away, but as she looked around the room, she stopped and smiled right at me, obviously glad to see that I was in the class. It wasn't until later that I would learn the reason why. And that is where I'm going to end. A Walk to Remember. Let me know if you enjoy this book, and I will keep reading it. And also, please let me know if you have any other book requests, or if you want to see any more continuations of books that I have previously read. I love any sort of feedback that you guys could give me in the comments below. And I hope that you have sweet dreams tonight and have a lovely, restful evening. And I will see you tomorrow in my next video.